Today's it's about talking about big firm practice areas self-destructing. And this is an important topic because this is something that actually happens quite a bit. And if you're caught on the wrong side of this, it can actually have a fairly bad effect on your legal career. Meaning you could actually, whoop, hold on. You could actually lose your position very quickly. So this is a topic that I like talking about. I've talked about it several times before, and I've actually seen this several times in my career because I've been doing this for so long. And when it happens, it's just not a good thing. And what tends to happen is every 8 years or so, and it's been longer than 8 years for now, but it's traditionally been about every 8 years. Practice areas will tend to will self-destruct. And what could happen, what the reason it generally happens is because of economic forces, but there can also be geographic forces and other things that actually happen, make it happen to just an individual firm. But the bottom line is that in most cases, if you've been practicing law for any length of time, your practice area is going to be hit at some point. And when that happens, you will definitely experience issues if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And a lot of times what happens is if you're in a law firm, you may assume that when things are busy, that you're going to be safe and everything's going to continue the way it is. But most practice areas in individual firms and then also in markets and cities and even nationally will go through major slowdowns. And I know lots of people that may have worked in law firms and worked 3,000 hours a year for several years. And then all of a sudden, there was a major slowdown in the practice area. And those attorneys ended up losing their positions. And that's not good when a case settled or anything could possibly happen. Then when the practice area self-destructs within a firm, or if the practice area will self-destruct, meaning it will actually just slow down and stop the work that the attorney is doing. It can happen with corporate. Sometimes it happens with litigation. It can happen with IP and all sorts of different practice areas or real estate. The attorneys are left with a lot of cases, very few options. A lot of them will move in with their parents. Some will go to business school. I've seen people go become writers, and I've actually seen some people do things like suddenly have mental problems or they don't have any work to do, or drug addicts, or join religious groups, or go in house, or join small law firms, or start their own practices, go to work for the government, or travel to foreign countries for several years and just bumming around. Or I've even seen people work as truck drivers, and occasionally I see people even take jobs in fast food restaurants. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's lots of attorneys that may say, I used to work at SCAD, and it could be any big firm. I'm not picking on SCAD because it's a great firm, or Sidley and Austin, and they have lost their jobs when things self-destructed. And it's not the fault of these firms, of course. It's just the way the market works. And I'm not joking about any of this. The thing is that it doesn't really matter where you went to school. It doesn't matter what your background is. If you're in a practice area that self-destructs, then that's very problematical. And I've been seeing this kind of problem my entire career, and I see it daily. I see the resumes of people that were blown out of the water during financial crises or when their practice area self-destructed, never got back on their feet. And I see these resumes daily. I know the problem's real, and it's not a good thing. And when this happens, these attorneys many times are turned into kind of pariahs in the legal community. You could be a very well-qualified attorney, but if you're one of like 50 corporate associates let go during an economic slowdown, then suddenly no firm may be interested in you because those firms are slow and they don't like people who are laid off. And it's just the way it works because it's not difficult. It is difficult. And when your practice area slows down, the reality is that many times the firms just don't want the attorneys that are let go. And when things do pick up at the firm again, the attorney who's laid off will be rehired because most firms are not interested in people they've formerly let go because those attorneys are going to come back and they're going to be a little angry, and it's just how it works. And so you could call up your firm that laid you off and say, I see from your website you have 5 openings for fourth-year litigators, and remind them they let you go a couple of years ago when they settled a big case. And then you could even explain to them that you've been living on peanut butter sandwiches and you got divorced and are driving a 20-year-old car and sharing an apartment. I've been looking for But honestly, those law firms won't care. And that's one of the things that's very sad about that. They typically do not hire people back that they've let go. They will say, basically, they leave us alone. It's just not nice. It's not that they're saying, we hate you or anything, but that this is the way it makes you feel. It makes you feel like they're saying when they ignore you, go under a rock and die and leave us alone. That's how it feels for people, I think, that I've spoken to. And they just don't want anything to do with you. And so you have to be very careful. the odds of being brought back to a firm if after you've been let go because things are slow they're not 0%, and they're probably a little bit higher actually than 1%, but they're not very high. That's a shame. And that's just kind of how it works. And so when practice areas are hit, what typically will happen in the market is attorneys in that practice area will lose their jobs in massive amounts. Firms that let those attorneys go often do not let them back. Other firms will rarely hire the attorneys who have been let go due to market forces, but also because they were let go. And attorneys who keep their jobs will have a very difficult time making partner or staying employed as partners. And then attorneys in that same practice area may find themselves unemployed for long periods of time, switching careers entirely or often stopping the practice law completely. And a lot of these attorneys may move back to where they're from or try to work in smaller markets, relocate to small markets to make much smaller salaries than they were making. But the thing that scares me about all this, and I'm going to talk about how practice areas kind of self-destruct within firms and locations, but the thing that scares me is that when this does happen to you, if it does happen to you, careers can end very abruptly due to this stuff. And it's scary and it's not a good thing. And it happens to attorneys all over the world and in all sorts of practice areas, and many don't ever recover. And so a lot of the things that I teach are where, about your work habits and the type of work you need to do and how you need to, perform as an attorney and so forth. The things that I teach are really out all of this. It's about not putting yourself in a situation. Because even if your practice area self-destructs, in most cases, law firms will try to keep close their best people. They're not going to let go their best people. And so you always want to be one of the best people, and you always want to have business, and you want to contribute a lot more than you take and really be one of the best people. The first practice area I want to talk about a little bit is litigation and how that can self-destruct. Litigation is the problem with litigation, and the reason it's an at-risk practice area is that things just can go south very slowly. And I was talking to an attorney the other day, been unemployed for over a year, and she started her career at Jones Day, which is a great firm. And then she moved over to Quinn Emanuel, which is another great firm, to work on a huge IP litigation involving Samsung. And she was very excited about it and able to work on a major case and get great experience. And she felt much better than she was getting at Jones Day. Lots of exposure to cool things. It was billing 3,000 hours a year for a few years. And then the case settled. And then she was suddenly on track to only bill about 1,500 hours a year. And Quinn's a great firm. They did nothing wrong. They just couldn't keep her around at her rate, and she wasn't profitable. So they let a lot of the people that they brought over to work on the case go. And now she's been looking for a job for over here. Now, that's not the fault of Quinn. It's just the way firms work. It's just business, and it's not her fault, and it's not the firm's fault, but it's a idea of someone getting laid off and not having a job and not able to get hired because they were laid off from a big firm. And obviously, I'm sure Quinn didn't let everyone go. There may have been a reason that they let her and not other people go. One of the oldest firms in California history, Heller Ehrman, is no longer around. It was founded in the late 1800s, and it closed its doors when several large cases settled one after another. And it happened very quickly. I think they had 3 or 4 big cases. They were keeping at least a couple hundred attorneys busy. And then those cases settled, that the revenue stopped coming in and they couldn't pay loans. And so the business, the firm literally went out of business. Another thing that happens is a lot of times litigation tracks the economy. Now, not always, but a lot of times it does. And so sometimes when the economy gets slow, litigation can get very busy. Litigation often gets busy during economic slowdowns because people start looking for ways to recover money they may have lost because they were making bad deals and so forth when the economy was active. Many large law firms, high hourly rates, and of course they want litigation work, and they will inflame tensions and so forth. And it's just how it works. There's nothing wrong with the attorneys doing that and get their clients to sue for money and so forth. And the defense lawyers will take the side of their client and tell them the other person's in the wrong. And so they will get the other side fired up. And so everyone will spend money to fight. And then same thing with contingency law firms. They're always happy to sue that they can make money. The point is that everyone gets very excited about suing and defending themselves. And during slow economies and during economic slowdowns, and if there's an economic slowdown, then people will say, let's sue the banks because we lost money because of them. And if there's an economic slowdown where the stock market crashes, people will sue the people that sold the stocks, it's just that the thing goes on and on. And when there's a boom and bust, there's typically a lot of lawsuits that are involved, and it just happens. And it's always been that way. A party who got sued during a bust will often be the party who made it out during the boom, and so forth. This is when a lot of people become litigators out of school, when there's, man, it's just, kind of history and the way things have worked. The other thing is that during economic slowdowns, one of the practice areas that a lot of law firms rely on, which is corporate, tends to become very slow. And law firms become very dependent on the revenues that litigators are generating to support and keep the firm going. Partners accustomed to making certain profits per partner, and every practice area all become dependent upon the revenues generated by litigators during this period. So the litigators turn up the heat, and they start billing their clients all they can. They find extra work to be done, research, more work that maybe needs to be done. And a lot of work is done and may not be necessary, but the firm needs the revenue, and the litigators are responsible for bringing in more revenue during those times. And it's just been very predictable that that's what happens. And it's happened that way for a long time. And one of the things just to think about as an aside is how the law firm ecosystem works. And it's always worked where one practice area slows down and then another practice area speeds up. So the revenues come in from that. And it's a good system, and it can work when things will slow down in different practice areas. But the thing is that I've seen with litigation as well, a couple of years ago, that after most economic busts and so forth, a lot of times litigation will get very busy for a couple of years. And then what happens is the litigation partners get resentful that they're generating more money for the firm. And then the corporate attorneys, and then they start looking around for new firms that will give them more money. And then we'll take their cases with them. And then the law firm will get slow in other practice areas. And then that can happen. They can lose a lot of their revenue. And this is what happened to another very old law firm in California, Brobeck, Feinger Harrison, which is one of the oldest law firms in California, and it actually self-destructed with most of the IP litigators, ended up leaving during a major economic slowdown. And then the other things that happens that's funny, and I've noticed it, is that when all this litigation starts picking up and all these companies get sucked into it, everyone starts to get these huge bills on both sides. And they realize the only thing that makes any economic sense anymore is to settle the cases in order to stop all this bleeding. And then, of course, against their attorney's advice, everyone starts settling cases as quickly as they can. And because of these huge bills, a lot of times the companies become very gun shy about filing more lawsuits. And so then litigation slows down again, which is funny. And that I think that happened to some extent. The litigation was very busy in New York many times after kind of the financial market slowed down. And then litigation gets extremely slow after people start getting very unsure about spending money. That's a cycle. And when that happens, when litigation slows down because of these cycles, even if you went to a really good law school, like Harvard Law School, and you're in New York City, you may have a very difficult time getting a position. And there may be a boom in corporate and other transactional work going on. But many litigators, when that happens, if another practice area like corporate gets busy, litigators will always be interested in switching practice areas and going into corporate and that sort of thing. But the thing to remember is just that litigation, even if you're very comfortable in it and you think things are going well, it always self-destructs, especially in large law firms. It's always operating in the background, and that's something to worry about. And it's difficult also in litigation as you become more senior, because your writing skills and so forth are often going to be the same or not much different than a 10th year attorney. And the fact is you can often be fairly easily replaceable by cheaper attorneys as you get more senior. And the cheaper attorneys often are much hungrier. Younger attorneys are hungrier than older ones. And the thing is, compared to litigation, tax, real estate, corporate, patent, other transactional practice attorneys, they often possess skills that are more technical. And it takes a long time to learn how to be a good tax attorney. And every day they're learning kind of new things. The same thing with corporate and patent attorneys. They often become more proficient the longer they have a certain type of technical work, and their increasing specialization often makes them much more unique and marketable. And another point is there are also lots of litigators out there, and those litigators are often considered a dime a dozen, meaning that there's just a lot of them. And as the litigator gets more senior, they'll typically join the ranks of other senior litigators. That makes it very difficult for them to be employable. And so a lot of things in the litigator's background, which are like clerkships, grades and so forth, are a little bit more important for them compared to a transactional attorney where with the transactional attorney, it's their experience so more that matters often than their background. The idea is if you're a corporate attorney that knows how to securitize subprime auto leases, you're often in much better shape than if you're just a regular litigation attorney or something like that, because there's not a lot of people that can do that as well. So that's helpful. And even large law firms, when you get out of school and you've been out for several years, they're not as concerned where as someone that may understand something like that went to school, and they often don't care how senior the person is. So in contrast, there's a lot of litigators practically coming out of the walls. There's just so many of them, and law firms can afford to be very selective. That's really all I have to say about litigation. There's a lot more I could say, but the big thing to remember is that you're never really safe as a litigator. I personally think it's a scary job in a lot of respects because of that. And you just need to be very careful about your future and making sure that you understand where you're vulnerable at and so forth as a litigator, because you can't really take anything for granted. If you're working on huge cases in a firm and they settle, you have to be really aware that you could lose your job. If you get older and you don't have any business, you have to be aware that you have the same sort of skills that a lot of other people have. And that can be very scary. And so the only way to really be secure as a litigator many times is to have a niche and to have your own business, I think, honestly, and to have very close relationships with clients, which really is not that hard. There's a lot of people that do it, and it's not something that should stop you. If you don't have a well-balanced practice, many times as a litigator, you're often better off working in smaller markets where you're working on a variety of different types of clients can be helpful, like small clients. And because in major markets, you tend to work on large clients, and that's where the cycles happen in the big firms more so than anywhere. And there's certain markets where it's very difficult to become a partner as a litigator, New York and others where things are much more financially dependent. And to be a litigator, you really have to have some pretty major skills to be good at it and to stay employed. And you have to remember that your past, a lot of times, what you've done is going to follow you. Meaning, if you want to work in a big firm, they're going to be concerned about your pedigree and that sort of thing. Whereas it's going to be less so if you have very marketable skills in a certain practice area, like especially transactional practice areas. And then there's a lot of things about litigation that I could talk about. But the big thing is you have to be secure in a large law firm. You either have to have or work very hard on that or be very exceptional at what you're doing. And really, it's very difficult. And if you're reliant on the work that your firm's bringing in, many times that's not a good long-term prospect. I've talked about a lot of firms that have gone out of business. It's a rare thing that happens, but it's not something that always happens. And then finally, the nice thing about litigation is there's just a lot of work and there's all over the country. There's tons of people that are there's litigation happening in every city and town and everywhere in the country. So it's something you can do a lot of different places, but you just need to be careful about relying on large law firms, the type of litigation you're doing, making sure you have a niche and really taking care and looking out for your career. I'm happy to answer questions about litigation. But there's just a lot of stuff to talk about with litigation. And it's a dangerous practice area to get into just from the standpoint, and I'm a litigator, but the reason it's dangerous is it's dangerous for a lot of reasons, but it's dangerous because there's more litigators than any other type of practice area. When you go to law school, you essentially learn how to be a litigator in law school. You learn briefs, you court, and all these sorts of things, but you don't learn how to be a corporate attorney. You don't learn how to be a patent attorney. You don't learn all these other things. So the litigation skill is something that a lot of people just don't have, and you need to be very careful. A lot of people have, and so it's much harder to stay employed. Okay, so the next one is corporate, and this is, I don't know if this is funny or not, but I hired an attorney, and he actually went back to practicing law, but I hired him from a good firm, and he's a well-known, a very good attorney right now, and he has a very successful. But I hired him and he came over to work during the economic slowdown. I think it was in 2000, 2001. And when he started, he was maybe 6'2", 6'3". He was a real tall guy, a couple 100 pounds, and he had great pedigree. And he joined in November of 2000, just when the dot-com bubble burst. And he couldn't believe that he was getting all these phone calls and meetings with these great attorneys that he was very impressed with. They were coming from Gibson Dunn, Simpson Thacher, Sullivan and Cromwell, and they were top law schools, Ivy League backgrounds and stuff, and wanted to get positions. And he'd come into my office, hold me a resume, and be like, "This person was number 5 in his class at Harvard Law School. This is incredible." I don't think Harvard ranks people that way, but they have different prizes that you'll get if you're after top 5 student after your first year and stuff. And I'd say he was unemployable. And he didn't believe me. He didn't believe that these people with these amazing backgrounds weren't employable, because who would think that someone with those sorts of background wasn't employable? And so he put everything he had into this. And it was actually sad, but after 3 months, I don't know, 160 pounds, that's a lot of weight loss, but he lost 20, 30 pounds at least, and maybe he was down to 160. This is an older article, so I might have had better information back then, but he was extremely thin, where before he looked very healthy. And I don't think he'd ever failed at anything in his life. And he was a superstar. And yet in the slow, couldn't get a job for anyone. And the thing is that the corporate market at that particular time, and this was a really bad slowdown, but it stopped in its tracks. This happens every 8 years. The corporate market freezes up, and it's not every 8 years, but for a while it was happening every 8 years. And a good portion of the attorneys can suddenly lose their jobs, and they don't know kind of what to do. And so the reason this guy, he couldn't even get anyone in interviews. And so he started working, he thought it was him. And so he started working longer and longer hours, and didn't understand that all this stuff was being driven by the market. In the 2008 slowdown, I saw one major law firm in Silicon Valley take all of its corporate attorneys and move them to a building on the campus where they sat, where these attorneys, sat waiting to get laid off. And it was, almost like being the law firm had this, it was a big law firm, and there's lots of big law firms in Silicon Valley, so I'm not giving away who they are, but they put them all in a separate office building that they were going to lay off. So they had 30, 40 corporate attorneys just sitting in this office with no work, because they didn't want to mix in with the other attorneys because it was so depressing. And they left them there in this purgatory. And then after a few months, they started letting them all go. And they would let go the ones with the worst qualifications go first. So the 3rd-tier law schools, and then 2nd-tier law schools, and then the bigger law schools, which is really something, but that's just kind of what happened. They let the people go that had the worst qualifications first. And that's what they do in all of these corporate slowdowns. A lot of times is they'll let the people that don't have the best qualifications go first, and then after them, let others go. And it's not funny, but it's something I've seen in every market. So the thing about corporate, just to explain real briefly, and there's not really a ton to explain about corporate, but there's a lot of, when the deal-making activity is very heavy, which is in good economies, corporate attorneys are brought in to document deals, to help with mergers, to help with stock offerings and all these sorts of things, or to just help govern corporate governance and stuff for all the new companies that are starting up or existing companies. And because the economy is doing well, all these companies and so forth are less sensitive to bills, and the corporate attorneys are providing the work done, and the people want them. And a lot of people out of law school go into corporate during these booms, and they have a lot of activity and things to do. And there's just a lot of work in the market. Markets like New York and the Bay Area and so forth get very busy. And so everything works very well, and everyone's very happy for a long time. But then what happens is, if there's some sort of thing that happens in the financial system, or I don't know, there's all sorts of problems that happen in the corporate market. There could be, in 2000, there was over exuberance for internet stocks and technology stocks, and then that all collapsed. And there was probably half the corporate attorneys in the country that were associates or negatively affected. And then 2008, of course, you had another financial crisis, and that slowed down lending and everything. And then, so there's all these things that happen in the markets. And when those happen, then people suddenly stop doing deals, and they stop doing stock offerings, and they stop raising money, and they're very cautious. And because of that, all the money is pulled back in, and people stop using corporate attorneys so much, and then the law firms let them go. And so this is just something that happens in cycles. And fortunately, I haven't seen it happen in years with corporate attorneys. What is your defense if you're a corporate attorney? Well, the nice thing about being a corporate attorney, in my opinion, is I think if you have good training as a corporate attorney, I think even in bad economic cycles, there's always places you're employable. You're employable if you're in a big city, in a smaller market, almost all the time. If you can find a good firm there, you're employable in all sorts of, different companies. You're employable, and your skills are quite marketable. But In larger markets, it can be much more difficult, especially if you're very specialized in securities and capital markets and stuff when there's nothing like that going on. Now, another thing that I would say that's important is you do need to be aware that if you are a corporate attorney, that when you are laid off, it does become much more difficult to find a job. So you're always trying to avoid being laid off. And that often means trying to align yourself with partners that have a lot of business is a very useful strategy to avoid getting laid off during slowdowns. The same thing goes for litigators. Another thing that's very helpful is as a corporate attorney, it's actually much easier to develop a business than it is in a lot of other practice areas because you can go in and do work for small companies, growing companies, and companies always need and are happy to pay for legal advisors. So to the extent you can, getting out of the office and meeting people, it is always a good thing to do. I know lots of corporate attorneys with huge books of business that are just advocates for their clients, and they're all the time. They're traveling around meeting people and stuff. So that, as a corporate attorney, I always recommend that your best security is having clients and work to do. And if you know what you're doing, you can always find different things for your work for your clients, even during slowdowns. So those are some of the things I recommend. And also, lots of corporate attorneys often go to work in-house with their clients. So you can many times get work with your clients if you like. So that's another thing that can be helpful. They'll often go in-house to work with their clients when the market slows down. They can sometimes go to work with clients. So just impressing everyone you're working for and doing the best job possible. Real estate is another one. I haven't seen real estate really slow down in a long time. It's been doing well for years. One of the things is when interest rates are low, that means that people buy real estate and their payments are low and so forth, and that can be helpful. And when I started my career, though, in the late 90s, the real estate market interest rates were relatively high compared to what they are today. I don't know, they're like 7%. And so my phone was always ringing real estate attorneys looking for positions, and the market for them wasn't good. There just wasn't a lot of opportunity. People thought back then that real estate wasn't a good investment. They thought that investing in internet stocks and stuff was a better investment. So all the money was flowing into the stock market and people weren't doing a lot of real estate investment, at least compared to what they are today. I was working with one attorney that had been unemployed for a few years and finally got him a position in a major law firm. And back then, I think for his level, the market rate was about $150,000 and the law firm offered at $90,000. And I said, well, that's less than you're paying your first year associates. And they said, yes, but we know that we have the only decent sized firm that in Los Angeles that has the work and we can pay them whatever we want. And which was sad, but that's how bad the real estate market was back then. This sort of thing I'm sure goes on, but I hadn't seen anything like that before. But regardless, this attorney was very happy that he got a position. But the market for real estate can freeze up and stop at different points in time. And these stops and goes can be due to economic, geographical, and other forces. And they're always kind of operating in the background. Different markets are good for real estate compared to others. So you're going to have a different experience working in a highly developed market where there's not a lot of real estate activity than if you're working in a market where there's a lot of real estate activity. So you just want to be careful. And real estate has, I would say, what I would call a time bomb built into it. So it's almost always going to slow down. But I haven't seen major slowdowns in my career, but it will slow down. And when it does slow down, you never really know why. It can be due to all sorts of different interest rates or market conditions in a certain area of the country, or lack of financing for real estate because of the credit markets and other things. So you just need to be aware of all that stuff. And a lot of times the real estate market is going to be dependent on the market you work in. So I've seen real estate attorneys have a lot of success moving to Los Angeles from other parts of the country, Idaho and Chicago and Florida and all sorts of things that they have the California bar mainly, but because there's a lot of real estate work in like Los Angeles, for example, or Orange County. And there's also a lot of real estate work now in New York where there wasn't a couple of years ago. And so everything kind of moves in cycles. The nice thing about real estate is it is a transactional practice area. So the thing to keep in mind with transactional practice areas is these are real skills, and not a lot of people have these transactional skills. And so if you have these sorts of transactional skills, then you're marketable and you have marketable skills. And the other nice thing is real estate can collapse in different parts of the country, but be active in another. In different parts of the country, real estate is always going to be maybe slow or go through a huge slowdown, whereas in other parts, it may be getting very busy. So An example would be certain cities in the country like Austin may be booming, or I don't know, Miami and Palm Beach may be booming, but during those same periods of time, Chicago and Atlanta may be doing really poorly. So you can always move as a real estate attorney, which is very nice. And that's something to be aware of. So I like real estate as a practice area. I also like the idea that if you have it as a practice area, you can always go in-house. So that's a real benefit of being in real estate, and because there's always developers and other people that need help. So it's a very good skill to develop as an attorney. Trademark's a weird one. In expanding economies, it does. Trademark is a practice area where if you have a lot of skill, you can do very well as a trademark attorney, but at the same time, it's not the most complex practice area. So a lot of times there's aspects of it that are complex, but a lot of the work is done often by staff attorneys or even paralegals. And so it can be difficult many times for big law firms to justify paying associates and so forth to do trademark work. And there's also never a ton of work at large law firms in trademark. What happens is during expanding economies, there's often a lot of work where everyone's trying to get things trademarked and get work done. And then when the economy slows down, all that work just slows down and may come to a stop. And then what happens is all of a sudden the experienced trademark attorneys are let go. There's been a lot of pressure on trademark too in larger law firms. A lot of them do not hire associates. They hire staff attorneys and so forth to do a lot of the or paralegals to do a lot of the work instead of attorneys. It doesn't necessarily matter to me one way or another who they hire, but I think that you have to understand that as a trademark attorney, you can often be very vulnerable to losing your position, getting laid off and so forth. And it's very difficult to become senior. The nice thing about being a trademark attorney, I think, is that you have the ability to to go in-house. There's a lot of in-house companies that need full-time, especially large companies, trademark attorneys, but it can be difficult to survive during a slowdown. A big law firm, that maybe has 3 or 4 trademark attorneys or 5 during a good economy will typically let go of the majority of them if the economy slows down. And so most trademark careers will often self-destruct due to the economy, and that's something to look at. Okay, patent prosecution. This is one of my favorite. The patent prosecution is always active in different parts of the country. So if you're a patent prosecution attorney, regardless of your seniority level, if you show the potential to get along inside of a law firm and get work done, not be a problem, and you have some employment stability in the recent past, then for the most part, you're employable. The most active parts of patent prosecution are always going to be electrical, physics, and hard sciences, but this has always been a pretty good practice area. There's been a lot of slowdown in the market in large law firms because a lot of the work in patent prosecution has gone to people doing fee arrangements, and large law firms prefer to do work on a billable hour. So many times that the work can slow down. But for the most part, it's a pretty good practice area. And if you can't do it in a large law firm, there's lots of small law firms where you can also make a good salary and make good money or get a percentage of whatever they're billing out the patents for. And there's certain branches of hard science prosecution where you maybe have experience working on wireless telecom, microchips, like semiconductors and so forth. And those can be very active at certain points in times, but then they can also slow down. One of the things that can often happen in patent prosecution is in some large law firms, they may become very dependent on one client. And if that work stops, you can lose your jobs. The other thing I've noticed, which is important, is there's certain markets where the legal fees are very high, like New York City, and law firms can't reasonably compete doing patent prosecution just because their rates are going to be much harder than people that can do the same work in smaller markets. It's not uncommon for companies like Amazon and Microsoft and so forth to have their patents being written in places like small law firms in rural Colorado. It's because the work is the same and they're doing things for the patent and trademark office. So it doesn't matter if the attorneys are remote. They don't have to be in a big office with expensive salaries and so forth. The work can be done a lot of other times. But the Bay Area is somewhat vulnerable to losing work, but there's a lot of very established work there. There's a very good ecosystem with a lot of technology companies and places being funded there. So it's a pretty good area. But patent attorneys, many times in smaller regions of the country, which could be, Kansas, Ohio, Sacramento, other different sorts of places, can sometimes be vulnerable. But most patent attorneys are in pretty good shape for the most part. I don't see patent really self-destructing. What I do see the self-destruction nature of it has been really limited to a lot of the biotech stuff. So biotech has gone through some booms and bust, and right now it's doing okay, but it can be very vulnerable. And especially if you're biotech, you don't have a PhD. So patent prosecution used to be this kind of very extremely marketable place. Practice here. I couldn't believe it. When I started in doing this work, one of my first offers was for a patent attorney. And this was in 2000, and law firms were offering them like $50,000 starting bonuses and stuff, which in this day and age is just would be unheard of. Even half that would be rare. There were just such a demand for them. And so many people needed them. I remember once it was funny. I think it was Baker McKenzie I was talking to, and I said, he's asking for a $50,000 starting bonus. Is that okay? And I was talking to this partner, and he just kind of sounded like defeated by the whole process because he was having a hard time finding people, as were all firms in the Bay Area at that time. And he just said yes. And I was like, I should have asked for 75 for the guy, and the guy still didn't take the job. That was how hard it was to find people back then. But like I said, life sciences can be very vulnerable. And then there's various branches that can slow down. For some reason, it was interesting, like the work for drugs and life sciences. And I remember 2015, the beginning of the year started, I got very busy. And then by March, it was dead. I have no idea. And I think that had to do because of some cancer drugs and development and the stopping. I don't know remember what it was, but the work can stop and slow just as quickly as it gets started. A lot of the IP science, life sciences work occurs in the Bay Area and to a lesser extent, Boston and San Diego, and then some cases in Jersey, DC area. Someone told me at one time some story about how all these areas are their military bases or airports or something. And then they position, all the labs for the life sciences are behind the runways because land is cheap. I don't know, I don't know what that was, but it was an interesting explanation. I wish I had written it down and remembered it. But a lot of areas, if you work in an outside area, like you work in a smaller market like Detroit or something, it always can be a little bit more difficult to find a new job. But the thing that's going on now is a lot of people are working remotely. It's not as difficult to do things as it used to be. And the same thing can happen in life sciences as hard sciences where people can become dependent on one client. And then most clients, like I said earlier, prefer people with PhDs. But for the most part, I've just seen patent prosecution never really crash. I think that certain aspects of patent prosecution have been slowing down, which should be like mechanical is continually slowing down. Biotech is not as active as it used to be, but anything to do with electrical and computers and so forth has always been busy. And while it's not safe, I do think that it's a pretty good practice area for the most part. And most patent attorneys it's an interesting group of people. And I don't know exactly what the reasons are, but a lot of times patent attorneys just aren't very nice to each other. So they will sometimes blackball people they don't like. I've seen that happen a lot. And I don't understand why patent attorneys are so rude and mean to each other, but it does happen. And if you're a patent attorney, it's almost like they don't really say the reasons why they're blackballing each other or they're so angry with each other, but there is a real kind of interesting culture of hostility that can really affect people. And I don't know why that happens. I think there's just a lot of grudges and stuff among patent attorneys that you don't see in other practice areas, and they're much more pronounced. I don't know if it's because people do something wrong with the patent. I don't know. Maybe it's a science thing, but that would be one of the big dangers of being a patent attorney. It's just getting blackballed by your peers because they can be pretty mean to each other. And I'm sure that happens in other practice areas, but the only thing I can say about patent prosecution is what I've noticed is it's a little bit harsher than anything else. Labor and employment is to some extent dependent on the economic conditions, but there's actually, in my experience, there's always been fewer labor and employment jobs during a good economy than a bad economy. I think a lot of the litigation work and stuff can pick up during bad economies. And I think that keeps attorneys a lot busier. There's certainly work for labor and employment attorneys to do counseling during expanding economies. So when new companies are getting started and growing and so forth. But I will say that during bad economies, I've always noticed labor and employment gets fairly busy. One thing that I would recommend if I was a labor and employment attorney that you think about is really trying to do whatever you can to get involved and have as much expertise as you possibly can. There's always there's all these kind of positions in labor and employment that require a certain type of expertise. So it could be OSHA or, I mean, I don't know, but there's certain aspects of labor and employment that require expertise. And there's always jobs nationally for people with that, if it's federal type of law and stuff. And so that's kind of cool. And the other thing I like about labor and employment is you can always go to work in-house, and there's always a demand for labor and employment attorneys in-house. I do that as an option for people as well, work to potentially go in-house as labor and employment. And labor and employment is that there's always work for defense and plaintiffs attorneys. And so I don't really see labor and employment ever quite self-destructing. But I do think that if you're a labor and employment attorney, one of the things to be aware of is just when the economy is very good, it can be much more difficult sometimes to find positions. And the markets where labor and employment does the best are often the markets where it's most difficult for people to do business because of a very pro-labor government. And then markets where, it's very pro-company, there's less work. I remember, I'll just tell you a quick story. It's funny, but one time I was going to lay off an attorney that worked for me, or not lay off, but fire an attorney that worked for me in Los Angeles. And at the same time, I was going to close an office in Utah that had about 25 people in it. And so I went to an attorney, and the attorney spent 20, 30 hours, of time researching and advising me on laying the attorney off in California, or letting the person go in California. But then in terms of closing an entire office in Utah, it took them maybe 5 minutes to tell me I could do whatever I wanted. One example is a very pro-employee state, and the other is a very pro-company state. Bankruptcy is an interesting practice area. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I doubt that there's a lot of bankruptcy people on this call, but obviously bankruptcy can be much busier during times of economic upheaval and slowdowns. But at the same time, when the economy is very good, many bankruptcy attorneys are very busy, very desperate for work. And so that can be the things that if you are a bankruptcy attorney, you can often hop around the country into different markets. Most large law firms, even if they don't have a lot of bankruptcy work, always want to have, if they have an office of 50 plus people, they always want to have at least one bankruptcy person in the office on staff if they're a full service firm. So that can be helpful. But work does slow down. The real opportunities are often with boutiques and ongoing kind of places that are doing a lot of bankruptcy work can often be one of the best places to. Tax law also has a lot of time bombs associated with it. If you're a tax attorney, a lot of the role is often supportive to corporate attorneys. So you're supporting M&A deals and other stock things. And so when that slows down, that can affect your work. But most law firms, I don't see a lot of ongoing tax layoffs. I think that they typically will come from, there's a lot of stability to tax attorneys. Another nice option that you can do as a tax attorney is you can always go to an accounting firm. And if you have trust in the state's experience, you're always going to be marketable in certain types of places with that. And tax work is often done inside a company. That work is often available as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. And during recessions, it can often be very difficult for tax attorneys to get jobs, especially in large law firms, because there's many times very few openings around the country. And being a tax attorney is a very competitive job. If you want to work in a law firm as a tax attorney, it's very competitive. I mean, especially in large cities, and they only typically hire people coming from other law firms. The experience in an accounting firm isn't given as much weight as I would like it to have, and it's very competitive. And you need to work in a place where there's ongoing work. Most tax attorneys will try to find themselves some kind of specialty within tax law that keeps them busy, gives them employment security, but that doesn't always happen. Partnership opportunities and so forth are also much more difficult as a tax attorney. Immigration laws, a lot of large law firms do immigration, but there's also a lot of smaller law firms with litigation. Immigration can be affected by politics. So a lot of immigration attorneys during very pro-immigrant administrations will do very well. And then if the government is anti-immigration for whatever reason, they'll do poorly. Democrats versus Republicans versus whoever is in office. And that should just give you a sense of how that works. So I do know that I try to make these webinars timeless. You've had administrations that are highly against immigrants, and during those times, immigration attorneys will be in bad shape and not a lot of work. And then when the opposite happens, they will have a lot of work. And then other one is people are always trying to come to the U.S. and stay when the economy is good, and then they're trying to leave when it's not. One of the things that I think is interesting is in the acting world, which I used to take acting lessons. I think was a lot of fun. Actors and others in the industry will always talk about other actors. And when they talk about them, we'll just say whether or not they're working. They'll say they're working. And it doesn't matter really. You don't ask if it's a play or a movie, television series. It's just that they're working. And so you should think about your career the same way. So you should be working and you want to be working. And if you're not working, then that's a problem. So you always want to stay employed. You need to understand the issues and the traps that could be in your practice area and make sure that if you see things coming down the line, that you're able to stay employed. Because if you're not employed, then it makes it look like you don't want to work or other people aren't going to hire you, or you're not aggressive enough at fixing your own solution. And you need to be on top of your game to stay employed. And the market is going to throw challenges at you. It's never easy. Someone said to me once, like, it's horrible owning property because you're constantly being assaulted by tax authorities looking for tax money and so forth. And that's true. And it's difficult to stay employed in large law firms. And once you realize all these forces conspired against you, but to persevere and be tenacious and so forth is important, because then others will say you're working. I'm going to take a quick break and then I will come back and answer some questions. Thank you.